Murder in Bethlehem. Who killed Holly Branagan? Holly Myra Branagan's massive Christian burial was held on Monday, April 2nd, 1979, at St. Anne's Catholic Church in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Memorial would follow at Holy Savior Cemetery. Holly had been dead for 5 days. During this time, Bethlehem had been beset with grief and shock by her murder. She had been stabbed to death with a 10-inch knife in her family's quiet and secluded home. Holly Branagan was an attractive, although somewhat reserved 17-year-old. Reserved, but coy at times, Holly had no problem making friends. She was happy and well-adjusted. She was a senior at Freedom High School in her hometown of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and was a member of the senior glee club and once a manager of the Freedom High School varsity soccer team. Her team number was 13. She was a good student with a B-plus average, with interests in music and mathematics. She also had nearly perfect attendance in school. She had plans to attend Pennsylvania State University in the fall of 1979. Holly's high school guidance counselor remembered her not having any disciplinary or academic issues. He assisted her with her application to Pennsylvania State University. He also recalled that Holly once had difficulty with a physics course that he helped her drop. Holly's music teacher had known Holly since she was a sophomore. She remembered Holly being a well-balanced, very mature student who was faithful and devoted in her attendance to musical activities. The music teacher recalled Holly being a very stable, beautiful person. Holly's classmates described her as primarily an all-American straight-laced kid, straighter than most. But she was also known to party with the best of them. Many of Holly's classmates remembered Holly's brother, Sean, having some wild parties at their home whenever their father was away. Sean was a member of the Freedom High School boys swim team. During his senior year, the swim team compiled its best record ever with 9 wins and 2 losses. The team ranked 3rd in their district. Several members of the team also broke records in the 200-yard individual medley and the 100-yard freestyle. There were plenty of beer and marijuana at the parties. Holly would actively participate in the drinking and smoking as well, although many said she never did either in excess. Holly would often just sit back and listen to Sean's friends blather on about sports, school, or their relationships. She hardly ever talked, and when she did on occasion, it was never about her feelings, which didn't surprise her brother's friends. Holly was a private person and carried herself well, but Sean's friends also knew she had a bit of a wild streak. Holly was attractive and tall with an athletic build. She was about 5 feet 8 inches tall and had short dark hair. She had a beautiful smile that was captivating. Holly reportedly did not have a steady boyfriend, but she did hang out with several of her older brother's friends and at least 2 full adult men that her friends recalled later to police investigating her murder. Holly's best friends, however, were a couple of girls, Cynthia Bove and Sally Ann Hancock. They described their friend as being a kind, dependable friend and perceptive listener. However, she just like she was with Sean's friends, Holly did not talk about herself or her feelings all that much. It was understandable since her mother passed away from leukemia on Thanksgiving Day in 1976 in St. Luke's University Hospital. Her mother was 47 years old. Holly was 14 years old, and Sean was 15 years old when their mother passed. Her father was 57. Since her mother's death, Holly had shown very little emotion outwardly. She seemed to keep her private thoughts to herself, which she often wrote about in her journal where she also tracked her menstrual cycle. Sophie Peggy Kutcher, Holly's mother, was born August 2nd, 1929 in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. She moved to the States in 1959 at the age of 28. The following year, Sophie married William Richard Branagan, a retired navigator in the United States Army Air Corps, in April 1959 in Caldwell, Essex, New Jersey. He was 10 years her senior. She gave birth to Sean in 1960 and gave birth to Holly on December 8, 1961 in Montclair, New Jersey. William, who was 6 feet and 2 inches tall with blue eyes and brown hair, took a job shortly thereafter at a local cement company in Nazareth, Pennsylvania. He was a sales manager at Lone Star Industries in Upper Nazareth Township, one of the largest American cement companies at the time. Before this employment, William had served in the military, having been drafted to serve during World War II on October 16, 1940, at 21 years old, while attending Bucknell University in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. He would earn his Bachelor of Science degree in Commerce and Finance in 1941, before serving in the military until 1947. For the next 12 years, he focused on himself and his parents until he met 29-year-old Sophie, fresh from Canada. The two would marry when she turned 30 years old and he was 40 years old. With rapid succession, Sophie gave birth to his son Sean and daughter Holly in 1960 and 1961. Finally, having a family of his own, William relocated his new family from their modest home in Montclair, New Jersey, into their new modern home at 469 Pine Top Trail, an affluent neighborhood in Bethlehem, to be closer to his place of employment. Following the death of her mother, Holly often kept herself busy with school clubs and sports and work, anything to distract herself from thoughts of her deceased mom. During the summer of 1978, Holly worked as a waitress at the Holiday Inn's Picador Terrace restaurant. She worked the breakfast to lunch shift. Her supervisor described Holly as being shy with a pleasant personality. However, she was also known for taking certain situations a bit too seriously at times. She would often get upset whenever a customer was unhappy with her or her service. She wanted to please everyone, which fueled her ambitiousness and drive. However, when school started back in the fall, Holly wanted a change in employment and left the restaurant and started working part-time at Bramberger's department store in the Westgate Mall after school 3 days a week. The previous school year, when Holly was a junior, she became a manager for the boys' soccer team at Freedom High School. She was responsible for filling water bottles, quarter oranges, and shag balls for the team. She joined the team because of a crush she had on one of her brother's friends, David Eltringham. It was during this year that the boys' soccer team swept through their season with 15 wins and 1 loss, led by their team captains, David Eltringham, John Simonsick, and Dave Joint. However, the team would lose their league championship game and prevent them from winning the district title. Despite being 1 year older than her at the time, David found Holly to be friendly yet alluring and asked her out on several dates during their winning streak. She accepted and would on occasion come over to the Eltringham household to hang out with David's family. In the process, she got better acquainted with his father, Sidney, and his mother, Julia. David would also hang out with Holly at her home and play with her dog, Clancy. Both Sean and her father came to accept David as a possible boyfriend for Holly. They both thought David was a good fit for her and would help her heal from the death of her mother. And for a brief time, it seemed as though David and Holly would be a permanent couple. But by the time of David's start of his freshman year in college, The two had abruptly ended their friendship. No explanation was ever given to her friends and family for the breakup. The following school year, Holly did not return as manager for the team. She focused instead on working after school at the Bramberger's department store 3 evenings during the school week and on the weekends. She continued to date, however, she did only for a week or two at a time and then moved on to another boy. She was determined not to have another serious relationship. On Friday, March 9th, 1979, Holly went on a date with one of her classmates to see the slasher film Halloween, starring Donald Pleasence and Jamie Lee Curtis. The horror film had a profound effect on her. She didn't realize at the time, but the decisions made in that film would also play out with her only 19 days later. In the film, 6-year-old Michael Myers stabs his sister to death with a chef's knife and 15 years later stalks and kills several female babysitters. On Wednesday, March 28, 1979, Holly woke and got dressed for school. Her father, William Branagan, was also getting ready for work in the bedroom down the hall. Her brother, Sean, was sleeping late. He was on spring break from college. He was a freshman attending Lehigh University, which was a 15-minute drive from his home across the Lehigh River. Holly's father reminded both Holly and Sean that he would be driving to Atlantic City after work for a business conference and would not be coming home that evening. He repeated that they would have to fend for themselves as far as dinner before leaving for work. Holly caught a ride with a friend to school while her brother remained home and went back to sleep. It was a sunny spring day in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Outside was moderately cool. It was near 50 degrees Fahrenheit by that afternoon. It was a typical weather for Pennsylvania in late March. Holly's father left work early at Lone Star Industries in the Upper Nazareth Township and drove nearly 2.5 hours to Atlantic City for his business conference. Also that afternoon, Sean decided to drive his father's 1974 Chevrolet Chevelle car to the home of Mark Viola, his best friend. Mark resided on Bel Air Road in the Hanover Township. Sean went over to work on repairs to his vehicle with Mark's assistance. Mark's home was 2.5 miles southwest of Sean's home and approximately 6 minutes away by way of residential back roads. Sean and Mark were both on spring break from Lehigh University. Remembering what his father stated that morning about not being home for dinner, Sean elected to eat dinner and spend the night with Mark and his family while they both resumed working on the Chevelle throughout the night. Meanwhile, Holly rode a school bus home from school. She would often be driven home by one of two girlfriends. However, on this afternoon, Holly decided not to ride with either of them. Holly got off the bus at Byers Bridge Road and Mountain View Circle, which was approximately 1/3 of a mile northeast and uphill from her home. She walked down the hill on Mountain View Circle as the road curved to the right and dead end in a cul-de-sac. She cut through the rear of the property in front of her at 3400 Mountain View Circle. A neighbor saw Holly walking toward her home at the rear of the property with a couple of school books in hand around 2:45 in the afternoon. Holly was approximately 600 feet away from her home at this point. She continued traveling southwest through the dense woods separating her home and the house at 3400 Mountain View Circle. Holly entered her property from the rear near the utility shed. She walked over to the front door of her multi-leveled glass, redwood, and concrete home. She noticed that her brother's car was gone from the driveway. Her parents built the house at 469 Pine Top Trail in 1965 Soon after, her father started working at Lone Star Industries on a wooded bluff in a secluded suburban neighborhood. The unique architectural design home had 3 levels of living space, despite appearing to be only 2 stories tall from the road. The home had 3 bedrooms and 2.5 bathrooms. The house sat on a hilly wooded acre near the intersection of Camelot Drive and Pine Top Trail. Holly climbed the stairs to the cedar deck that ran the entire length of the home and wrapped around it as well. She entered the home through the slide glass patio door at the kitchen and dining area on the 2nd floor. Each room on the main level of the home had a glass sliding door that opened onto the cedar deck. Holly was immediately greeted by their Cocker Spaniel Clancy, who was very pleased to see her. She placed her school books on the counter before playing with him for a bit. She then fixed a bowl of leftover gelatin and grabbed a bottle of Diet Pepsi out of the refrigerator for a snack. Holly, with Clancy following, walked through the kitchen and past the dining room/living room combination with a wall of windows that provided exposure bathed in natural light with spectacular views of the surrounding mountains in the distance. She then ascended the stairs to the 3rd level of the home where the bedrooms were located with her snack and drink in hand. The design of the house gave the appearance that there were only 2 floors from outside, but once in the residence, it was quite easy to see that the dwelling had a slight 2.5 floors. Holly entered her bedroom, placed her dessert and soda on her nightstand, and began changing out of her school clothes into something much more relaxing and comfortable. She dropped her school clothes on her bed before walking out of her bedroom and into her father's bedroom to grab the phone. She noticed that her father's bed was not made up, but she couldn't judge. No one bothered to make their beds since their mother passed. She dragged the phone into her bedroom and sat on her bed to call Cynthia Bove, one of her friends. Cynthia was a manager of the boys' soccer team. Holly told Cynthia that she would be going to the local Pizza Hut for dinner with Sally Ann Hancock's, since her father and brother were not home. She also was not in the mood to cook anything that evening. The 2 friends continued to converse for another hour and a half with Holly's radio playing softly in the background. They listened to many of their favorite songs from the Bee Gees, Too Much Heaven and Tragedy, Chic's La Freak, Rod Stewart's Do You Think I'm Sexy, and Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive. In between songs, Holly disclosed to Cynthia that she had recently engaged in unprotected sex with someone that passed weekend after he had driven her home from work at Bamberger's. She expressed some concern over the incident and was fearful that she might end up pregnant. Cynthia naturally followed up by asking her who the person was she had sex with. Holly didn't answer the question. Cynthia was curious. Was it even someone that she knew? Was it Holly's main crush? Or was it the guy from the soccer team that had a huge crush on Holly? Around 4:30 p.m., there was an unexpected knock at the door, followed by the doorbell ringing. Clancy, who was lying on the floor next to Holly's bed, jumped up and started barking. Holly immediately thought her friend Sally Ann Hancock had stopped by earlier than planned to pick her up for dinner. Holly told Cynthia to hold on for a minute while she went and checked the front door. She placed the receiver on her bed and walked down the flight of stairs to the front door on the 1st level. As she approached the front door, she could make out a person standing outside just beyond the windows. Clancy was close behind her. Holly opened the door and was surprised to see a visitor. Their conversation should have been a brief one, however, it ended up lasting considerably longer. As a result, Holly allowed the person to enter the home and follow her up to the main level of the house on the 2nd floor. Holly then excused herself briefly to pick up the phone in the kitchen to tell her friend Cynthia Bove that she would call her back. Cynthia would later tell the authorities that she could hear someone in the background that sounded like an older person, but could not distinguish who exactly it was. Cynthia did not detect any unusual tone in Holly's voice. She seemed like her typical self, and she didn't hear any more barking coming from Clancy either. Police would later state that Holly made 2 phone calls after ending the call with Cynthia. The first call was to her brother's best friend, Mark Viola, to speak with her brother. However, Mark's mother explained to Holly that neither Sean nor Mark were home at that exact moment. They had been working on Sean's Chevelle earlier and had gone up the street to give the car a test drive. As a result, Holly didn't speak to him. She did leave a message with Mark's parents for Sean to call her back when he had a moment. The second phone call was to Holly's father's office at Lone Star Industries. She asked the receptionist if her father had already left for his trip to Atlantic City. The receptionist informed Holly that he had. Holly immediately ended the call, without elaborating why she had called in the first place. At around 5:00 p.m., Cynthia both tried to call Holly back, but was not able to get through. The phone rang busy. Cynthia thought this was odd. At the same time, Sean, who returned from his test drive with his friend Mark, was also trying to call his sister back but kept getting a busy tone. He didn't think much about it though. He assumed his sister was on the phone with one of her girlfriends. He ended the call and continued working on his car after having dinner with Mark's family. Sally Ann Hancock, who was supposed to pick Holly up for dinner at Pizza Hut, later told police authorities that when she arrived at Holly's home around 6:00 p.m., she honked the car horn. When no one came to the door, she got out of the car and knocked on the front door. Still, Holly did not come to the door. However, a few minutes later, Clancy trotted down the stairs to the front door and barked at her before going back upstairs. Sally Ann knocked again. Still, no Holly. Sally Ann thought to herself, why would Holly make arrangements with me to go to dinner and not come to the door after my repeated knocks? She said she decided to make her way to the rear of the home to investigate. Maybe Holly was in the bathroom getting ready and couldn't come to the front door, she thought to herself. Sally Ann slowly walked around the carport to the right of the house and up the cement curb, which led to the cement sidewalk that curved toward the side of the home and the cedar stairs of the deck on the second level of the home. As she approached the stairs, she noticed Holly's bathroom light on. Then she began hearing slight moaning coming from the kitchen and Clancy whimpering softly. The television was on. Sally Ann said she was grasped with a very odd feeling and could not muster the courage to ascend the stairs any further. She didn't know what she might have seen since the noises seemed to be coming directly from the kitchen. She regrettably decided to walk back down the hill to her car and leave. Throughout the remainder of the evening, several calls were placed to the Branagan's house, all of which were unanswered. Some incoming calls were rerouted to surrounding houses on the same block, though this was believed to be a phone error where lines were accidentally crossed by the phone technician working on the phone lines in the neighborhood earlier that day. Sean tried repeatedly to call his sister throughout the evening to let her know that he would not be returning home for the evening. He was never able to get through to her because the phone continuously rang busy. The next morning, around 7:00 a.m., Sally Ann Hancock stopped by Holly's home once again. She couldn't get through to her the previous evening after repeatedly calling her home and getting a busy signal. She had stopped by to take her to school as usual. Sally Ann lived at 235 Pine Top Trail, approximately a half a mile west of Holly's home. However, after honking her horn several times and getting noticed by Branagan's neighbor from across the street, she got out of her car and knocked on the front door. Clancy came to the door, whimpered, and then walked back to the main level. Holly did not come to the door. Sally Ann peered into the long, narrow windows that flanked both sides of the front door. She could see the first floor garage to the right and the utility room to the left. After a few minutes, Sally Ann assumed Holly had gotten a ride from her brother to school since the family's car was not present. She left without investigating further. Around this time, Holly's brother, Sean, awoke at Mark's home. He was still perplexed why Holly hadn't called him back last evening, and even more perplexed that he hadn't been able to get through on the telephone to speak with her. Sean tried calling his sister at home once more before she went to school. He got a business signal again. He thought it was odd, but didn't think much more of it. Perhaps Clancy had knocked the phone receiver off the telephone. That would explain the busy signal he kept getting. After eating breakfast and completing some last-minute repairs to his car, Sean and Mark drove his car back to his home, cutting through neighborhood streets to get there. They drove up a slight hill and turned right at Sean's home. The whole drive took less than 10 minutes to complete. Sean exited his vehicle with Mark right behind him. They both entered the home from the front door at the carport. As they entered, they both felt an eeriness they had never felt before. Clancy did not greet them at the front door, as was his usual habit. As they climbed the stairs up to the main level of the home, they could hear Clancy whimpering from the kitchen. Mark took the lead and Sean followed. Suddenly, Mark stopped in his tracks as he entered the kitchen, causing Sean to bump into him. Mark turned and pushed Sean out of the kitchen. Mark ordered Sean to run next door and call the police. Sean diverted his gaze toward the deceased body of his sister, lying on the floor in front of the sliding patio door and the stove. The bloody area around her was covered in bloody paw prints from Clancy. Her eyes were wide open, staring at the glass patio door. Her arms flanked at her sides. The back of her white blouse with floral prints was covered with dried blood. Her body had already started to decompose. Whimpering, Clancy was lying next to her in Holly's blood. 2 kitchen chairs were knocked on the floor near her feet. A small cuckoo clock, which usually hung from the wall beside the patio door, was on the floor next to Holly, stopped at 5:40 p.m. When he finally dawned on them what must have happened to Holly, the boys' reaction quickly turned to fear. They were fearful that Holly's attacker could still be in the house. Both Sean and Mark hurried out of the house and ran to the nearest neighbor's home directly across the street from the Branagan's home. When they made it to the house, Sean asked Mark, "Is Holly dead?" Mark hesitated before telling his best friend he thought his sister was gone. Sean started crying. Mark tried to comfort him, but he didn't know what more he could say in the moment. He knocked on the door of the neighbor's home and started yelling, "Someone please help." The neighbor opened the door. Mark explained that something terrible happened at the Branagan's house and that the police needed to be called immediately. Sean then had the neighbor call his father through his company. They eventually tracked Mr. Branagan down at the conference to inform him that he was needed urgently at home. Minutes later, Bethlehem police officers arrived at the Branagan home. Both Sean and Mark were outside the house, waiting patiently for them to arrive. Sean pointed toward the second floor kitchen glass patio door. The officers began walking up the side of the home where the entrance to the kitchen was located. Sean followed them to the sliding glass door and unlocked it for them. He pointed toward his sister lying on the floor with the blade of a 10-inch butcher knife sticking out of her right shoulder. There she is, he informed the officers. Both officers pushed Sean back and entered the kitchen with their weapons drawn. They immediately noticed a small television playing on the kitchen counter near the entrance to the hallway. The television was turned to Channel 6, an ABC affiliate station. The receiver to the kitchen telephone was lying on the counter. There was a bloody towel on the stove. Refrigerator magnets were scattered on the stove as well. A small cuckoo clock was on the floor next to Holly. 2 kitchen table chairs were lying on the floor near Holly's feet. A broken kitchen knife handle was on the floor next to Holly's body. They exited the kitchen and then moved about the entire residence. The officers noted a second telephone with the receiver being off the telephone on Holly's bed in her bedroom and a bathroom light turned off. The officers eventually determined that there was no other party in the home and no evidence of a struggle throughout the household. One of the officers went to his car to notify the police department by dispatch that more officers were needed to respond to a homicide at the residence. No lights were on in the entire home except for the bathroom that both Holly and Sean shared. The home soon became inundated with police officers from all departments, including the traffic division. Officers were also moving items around inside the kitchen since the room seemed to be the only area disturbed in any way in the home. The 2 kitchen chairs that were knocked over in the apparent struggle between Holly and her attacker were placed back in their upright positions. Police equipment like the camera used to take pictures of the crime scene was placed on the kitchen table, possibly contaminating the crime scene further. Other officers failed to collect the bloody towel found on the stove into a bag to be tested. Fingerprints were also taken, although there weren't many to be found. There were a few partial fingerprints and 1 partial palm print found in the kitchen. Holly was stabbed 18 times in the back with a 10-inch butcher knife. 3 inches of the broken blade was still protruding out of the right corner of her back. The damaged knife handle, along with the broken blade, was on the floor next to her body. The autopsy, performed the very next evening by a forensic pathologist, would conclude Holly had 15 serious knife wounds and 3 slight wounds, 2 defensive wounds and small slashes, which were discovered on her hands from possibly trying to guard herself against the knife attack. The knife was determined to have come from within the Branagan home. There were no fingerprints found on the handle of the knife. No blood was found either. It appeared to have been wiped clean before being tossed to the floor next to Holly. The perpetrator also seemed to wipe down the kitchen before tossing the bloody towel onto the stove. The autopsy concluded that Holly was not sexually assaulted at the time of her attack. Although the autopsy did show that she had engaged in sexual activity several days prior, a few degraded sperm were found in Holly's vagina from several days past. There weren't any signs of large amounts of fresh sperm or trauma to her vaginal area. It was determined that Holly had engaged in a consensual sexual act approximately 2 to 3 days prior to her death. The act did not lead to a pregnancy. Small traces of cannabis were found in Holly's system, suggesting that she had smoked marijuana in the days leading up to her murder. Officers found small amounts of marijuana in a purse belonging to Holly in her bedroom. Her friends would later tell police during several interviews that Holly smoked marijuana sparingly and drank beer on occasion, but never to excess. The attack did not appear to be planned or premeditated. It seemed to be sparked in the heat of an intense, high emotional event. The attack was vicious and intimate. Holly likely knew her assailant. The entire attack might have taken up to 30 to 40 seconds in all. The time of death was established to be around dusk the following evening. Sunset was around 6:45 p.m. on March 28. Holly had been deceased for over 18 hours. There didn't appear to be any forced signs of entry into the home. There were no shattered windows, damaged door locks, crowbar scratches on the door jambs, or doors kicked inward with intensity. It all suggested that the perpetrator had free access into the home. Officers canvassed the neighborhood for clues and interviews. Nothing of any significance was found. None of the neighbors noticed anything out of the ordinary in and around the Branagans' residence. Although one or two neighbors remembered hearing a scream in the early evening, it was strange that a young teenage girl could be murdered inside her home and no one saw anything unusual. What was even more frustrating was that a lot of the Branagan neighbors with children around Holly's age or who were attending the high school suddenly were not willing to help the investigation. Parents got lawyers for their children that wouldn't allow their children to provide new clues to help narrow in on a suspect. The main investigative techniques of the time were interviews, photographs of the crime scene, fingerprints, and identification of blood types. There were 24 photographs taken of the crime scene, properly collecting and storing evidence in the attempt to extract DNA were not even considered in 1979. The broken knife handle was bagged to be tested for blood types, even though it did not appear to have any blood on it. The test yielded no results for blood types. The fingerprints found at the scene were dusted and photographed. No matches were made to any known criminals. At one point, investigators identified 6 people who may have been involved, including male and female classmates of Holly's, as well as a person who lived in the neighborhood. All were cleared eventually in the days, weeks, and months of Holly's murder. Holly's brother Sean was the main suspect for a brief time for many in the town of Bethlehem. He lived under a cloud of suspicion until he died from a tragic accident months later. Sean worked part-time at a local service station while attending college at Lehigh University. His hobbies were fixing cars, which was his way of distracting himself from the pain of losing his mother at such an early age. On the night of his tragic accident, he was cleaning the floors of the garage with a flammable liquid. The air compressor started, and a short circuit in the fuse ignited the fumes in the enclosed garage. Within seconds, the garage exploded in an intense firebomb, gravely injuring Sean. Mark Viola, who was working with Sean at the gas station, rushed to his aid. Sean was completely covered in fire. Mark did his best to put out the flames before getting help. Within minutes, Sean was driven to the hospital down the road from his employment. Sean's father again was alerted to another tragedy involving one of his family members. He dropped everything and rushed to the hospital. Law enforcement were also alerted to the accident and the prospects that many doctors did not believe he would recover since he had third-degree burns over his entire body. Several detectives rushed to the hospital in the hopes of getting a deathbed confession. Sean was repeatedly questioned about the murder of his sister. He denied having any role in her passing or knowledge of anyone who might want to harm his little sister. With his father and Mark by his side, Sean succumbed to his injuries a few days later and died. In the hopes of coming up with a suspect, since law enforcement had exhausted all relevant leads initially, they turned to Holly's diary. She primarily used her diary to track her menstrual cycle, but she also recorded cryptic details about being attracted to several teenage boys slightly older than her and a couple of much older men. Of course, she never revealed any of the men by name. She assigned vague hints and numbers to each of them. One item of interest was the number 32, which came up frequently in the diary, and the suggestions that this person was much older than her. When law enforcement interviewed Holly's friends and classmates, they were told that the number 32 referred to a young man named George Wilson. Holly mentioned having a crush on him and wanting to go out with him. Her friends did not know to what extent the relationship was currently in. When George Wilson was interviewed by police, he was able to provide a solid alibi during the time of Holly's murder and was cleared of Holly's tragic murder. George Wilson did not know why Holly would refer to him as number 32 or the significance of the number. Two more suspects would emerge over the years. David Eltringham, a young man Holly managed during her time as manager of the boys' soccer team when she was 16, and David's father, Sidney Eltringham. David was the same age as Holly's brother, Sean. He was also one of the co-captains of the soccer team and led them to an astounding 15 wins and 1 loss season. Holly cheered on her team and never missed a game during the season. David took the team all the way to a soccer league championship game and potential district title. Ultimately, the team fell short and lost their championship game. David and the Eltringham family were well known to the Branagan family because of their amazing season. Rumors were adrift that David had a crush on Holly and vice versa. The two casually talked, but friends of Holly could not substantiate whether the two were secretly dating. Sidney Eltringham, the father of David Eltringham, Holly's friend from Freedom High School's boys soccer team, had multiple run-ins with law enforcement. Police were called to his home on multiple occasions because of domestic disturbances throughout the 1980s. He was never charged in those earlier instances, despite admitting to losing his temper and throwing things in his home. However, on July 23, 1990, he was finally charged with harassment after police arrested and charged him for shoving and throwing household items at his wife, Julia. Sidney was also summoned to appear in court on January 10, 1991, regarding a lawsuit filed in the Lehigh County Court by Cynthia Lynn Peters, alleging that her husband, John F. Peters, owner of the Twin Lakes Country Club in North Whitehall Township, and Sidney Eltringham, who was a private investigator on the side, conspired to cheat her out of alimony and other support. Also, on July 22, 1992, Sidney was charged with simple assault and reckless endangerment for trying to run down a Northampton County Constable, Charles Siegfried, who was trying to serve him papers regarding an unknown incident at his home at 3074 Avon Road. Constable Siegfried saw two cars in the driveway. As he approached the residence, he heard music playing on the radio from inside the home. He rang the doorbell, but no one came to the door. He returned to his truck parked on Shakespeare Road at Avon Road and began surveying the home. A short time later, Sidney and his wife exited the home. The constable immediately pulled his truck in front of the driveway, preventing Sidney from backing out of the driveway. Sidney got out and identified himself, and the constable got out and identified himself. He tried to serve Sidney in the driveway. However, Sidney and his wife got into their car. Sidney yelled at the constable to move his truck before maneuvering his vehicle at an angle in the driveway that almost struck the constable. Sidney then put the car in reverse and hit the constable in the back of the legs as he forcefully backed out of the yard. The constable quickly placed the court summons under the windshield wipers, but as Sidney's car drove away, he turned on the windshield wipers and the papers flew off onto the street. He was apprehended shortly afterwards at a traffic stop made by law enforcement. Sidney and his wife, Julia, owned a business named BDA Security and Investigative Agency, Inc., associated to Eltringham and Associates, Inc., that began operating in the late 1980s, following the many run-ins Sidney had in the early 80s while employed as a psychology professor at the local community college. Their business was located at 2419 Willow Park Road in Bethlehem, Northampton, Pennsylvania. Julia served as the business president while her husband served as the treasurer and private investigator. Rumors in Bethlehem were that Sidney became an investigator primarily because he wanted to solve Holly's murder. He was going around the Lehigh Valley area interviewing people to collect information to solve her murder. In 2014, Sidney was brought in and testified before a grand jury to his involvement in the murder of Holly Branagan. A couple of people said they could place him at the Branagan home the evening of Holly's murder. It is believed those two people were Cynthia Bove and Sally Ann Hancock. However, due to lack of physical evidence linking Sidney to the murder, the grand jury refused to indict him, and he was never charged. Sidney was later diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He was hospitalized in his last dying days in late 2015 and early 2016. Investigators tried to visit the hospital to interview him, but his wife refused to let them enter his room. Sidney died on February 12, 2016, surrounded by his wife and family. So what happened the evening of Wednesday, March 28, 1979? The evening that Holly Branagan was murdered. This is purely speculation on my part, but based on my own investigation into the murder, I strongly believe that Holly's murderer is someone not known to law enforcement or friends and family of Holly Branagan. Here's what I think happened that fateful evening. Holly was on the telephone with her friend, Cynthia Bove. At around 4:40 p.m., there was a knock at the door. Holly told her friend that someone was at the door, then walked downstairs to answer. It was a male acquaintance she met while working at Bamberger's department store in the Westgate Mall. The male was either someone she worked with or a customer that was smitten by her. Since Holly did not drive all that much and did not have a car of her own, I am theorizing that this male acquaintance probably drove her home at the end of her shifts on several occasions, but never entered her home because of either his age or ethnicity. Holly knew her father and brother would be upset if they knew she was secretly dating a minority or an older guy. This person knew Holly well and knew she would not be working that Wednesday evening and dropped by to see her. I am also going to say that this was the person she may have had sexual relationships with on Monday, March 26, 1979, after her shift ended at work, most likely in his car parked in a secluded area near her home. The two probably smoked a joint to get themselves in the mood, and heavy petting led to sex. She probably even told this person her work schedule and that her father was going to be out of town later on in the week. So when this person showed up at her home, Holly was surprised and invited him into her home, leading him up to the kitchen on the second floor. She then picked up the phone and told Cynthia that she would call her back. She also reached out to her father's employment and her brother's friend to make sure no one would be home, since this person wasn't allowed in her home. While Holly was on the phone with her father's employment and Mark Viola's mother, this person was probably playing around with Clancy in the kitchen. This person and Holly flirted and may have even started kissing. Things were probably moving a bit too fast, and Holly tried to slow it down. After all, she was worried that she might be pregnant, and it would be very difficult to explain away a pregnancy to someone she was probably not supposed to be messing around with. The situation escalated beyond Holly's control. The acquaintance probably even refused to stop kissing on her, and Holly grabbed a knife to get him to stop. This was her mistake, because this only enraged the guy, and he wrestled the knife away from her, cutting her hands in the process. Holly screamed before turning and racing toward the sliding glass door, and the guy panicked and stabbed Holly in the back to get her to stop screaming. During the scuffle, 2 chairs were knocked over, and the clock was knocked off the wall. The guy ended up stabbing Holly over 15 times in a fit of rage, only stopping because the knife broke off in Holly's right shoulder blade. In her dying moments, lying in front of the stove and dishwasher, Holly turned her head towards the glass patio door and freedom. When he calmed down, he realized that he would be in serious trouble and started cleaning up the crime scene. He wiped the knife of fingerprints and blood using a kitchen towel he found on the counter. He then tossed the knife handle onto the floor next to Holly and placed a bloody towel on the stove. Clancy, who was beginning to get agitated, was simply ignored by the perpetrator as he continued cleaning up the scene. He then exited quickly from the home, but not before taking the phone off the hook in the kitchen and turning on the television. When Sally Ann Hancock arrived around 6 o'clock to take Holly to dinner, and slowly walked around the house to approach the stairs leading up to the second-floor deck, she noticed Holly's bathroom light on and heard slight moaning coming from the kitchen over the television and Clancy's whimpering. I'm sure Sally Ann assumed that Holly had made other plans and went to dinner with someone else, or she was in the house having sexual relations. So she turned around and went home. As she climbed the stairs of the deck and went to the kitchen glass sliding door, she probably would have found Holly bleeding out on the kitchen floor. We may never know who the true culprit of this crime is without many advances in DNA techniques. I'm sure once that happens, many are going to be shocked that the culprit was someone no one would have ever guessed. Thus, the case of Holly Branagan's murder comes to a close.